Excellent. Continuing the series of first-part series on gaining knowledge about American history, Chapter 1, Ancient Civilizations and the First Nations, told in a calm, immersive voice that blends verified history with lyrical narrative, designed to be enjoyable for Americans to read slowly or listen to, like a long evening story. Chapter 1, The Ancient Civilizations and the First Peoples, the Anasazi, Iroquois, Cahokia, and the Indigenous Roots of American Civilization. Before any compass needle found north, before ships wrote white scars across the sea, this land was already old. Wind had spent 10,000 years sculpting its edges. Glaciers had carved valleys that would one day cradle cities. The first peoples who stepped upon it carried with them stories older than the mountains themselves, stories whispered across generations like embers kept alive through cold nights. The arrival across the ice. Scholars believe the earliest ancestors of today's indigenous nations began their long migration during the last ice age, crossing the Bering land bridge that once joined Siberia and Alaska. They did not come all at once. They came in waves, families following herds of caribou, hunters chasing shadows of mammoth, gatherers carrying seeds and fire. When the ice melted and the oceans rose, the bridge disappeared, but the people remained, spreading south and east across vast horizons. They learned to read the continent's moods, where the salmon ran thick, where the bison grazed, where desert yielded cactus fruit and canyon pools. Their tools grew more refined, projectile points like flint feathers, baskets tight enough to hold water, songs that mapped rivers more accurately than any future surveyor's grid. In those early centuries, time was measured not by kings or conquests, but by migrations and harvests. Every valley and mountain took on a spirit, every season a name. The land was not something owned. It was a living relative, sometimes generous, sometimes fierce, always sacred. Civilizations of earth and sky. As centuries passed, communities grew into civilizations. They built not only shelters, but whole worlds of meaning. Along the Mississippi and its tributaries rose the mound builders, societies who shaped the earth into great ceremonial platforms and burial mounds. The largest at Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, held tens of thousands of inhabitants between the 11th and 13th centuries. Its central mound rose nearly 100 feet, wider at its base than Egypt's Great Pyramid. From its summit, priests and astronomers watched the sun align with wooden calendars, marking equinox and solstice. The city's plazas buzzed with trade, shells from the Gulf, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies, all proof of a continental network humming with exchange. Farther south, in the deserts of the American Southwest, the Ancestral Puebloans built multi-storied stone villages in cliffsides, Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, aligned with lunar cycles and cardinal points. They engineered irrigation systems that carried life through bone-dry lands, and their pottery carried geometric patterns that spoke of order and balance. To walk among their ruins today is to hear the faint echo of corn grinding, of children laughing between adobe walls, of a culture that measured wealth in harmony rather than gold. On the Great Plains stretched societies of hunters who followed the bison, moving with the seasons, using every part of the animal. Hides for shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread. Their mobility was not restlessness, but adaptation, an understanding that the world moves, and so must those who live within it. In the Pacific Northwest, cedar and salmon shaped a maritime civilization. Totem poles rose like wooden prayers. Canoes carved from single trunks carried families across fog-veiled waters. Wealth was shared in ceremonies called potlatches, where the act of giving away possessions was the highest expression of power. They knew that abundance only stayed abundant when circulated. Languages of the land. By the time European explorers dreamed of a Western passage, North America spoke in 1,000 tongues. Linguists today group them into great families: Algonquian, Iroquoian, Sioux, Atascaban, Uto-Aztec, but each language carried unique philosophy. Some had no word for ownership. Others used a single verb to mean both to breathe and to live. In these languages, the boundary between human and non-human blurred. Wind, river, coyote, and man all participated in the same moral conversation. Oral tradition was the library. Elders memorized not only stories, but laws, remedies, genealogies, and star maps. When they spoke, it was both education and ritual. A story might tell how Raven stole the light, or how Coyote taught humility, but beneath each tale ran practical wisdom: how to plant, when to migrate, how to maintain balance. Children listened not just to entertain their imaginations, but to learn survival and ethics intertwined. Trade, science, and art. Trade routes laced the continent long before Columbus. From the Arctic to Mesoamerica, goods and ideas moved like river currents. Shells from Pacific beaches were found in the Midwest. Macaw feathers from the tropics adorned headdresses in Arizona. The movement of goods was also the movement of stories and technologies, new ways to weave, to carve, to heal. Art was everywhere: pottery, beadwork, woven belts, carved masks, all carried symbolic language. The Iroquois crafted wampum belts of shell beads that recorded treaties and historical events. In the Southwest, Hopi artisans painted kachina dolls to embody spirits of rain and fertility. On the plains, winter counts painted on buffalo hides served as calendars, each pictograph marking the most significant event of a year. Medicine was not superstition. It was empirical observation woven with spirituality. Healers knew which plants eased fever, which bark numbed pain, which roots purified wounds. Ceremony amplified healing by aligning body and spirit, a form of holistic science millennia before the phrase was coined. Governance and philosophy. Among the most remarkable political systems to evolve was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to Europeans as the Iroquois League. Formed centuries before contact, it united the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations under the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that balanced local autonomy with shared decision-making. Clan mothers appointed chiefs, oratory and consensus replaced coercion. Many historians later noted its influence on the framers of the U.S. Constitution, a lineage rarely acknowledged but deeply instructive. Democracy did not arrive on ships. It already existed in the soil. Elsewhere, governance adapted to environment. On the Northwest coast, leaders gained status by generosity. In the plains, leadership was fluid, earned through bravery and wisdom rather than heredity. In Pueblo societies, matrilineal systems gave women central roles in property and ritual life. Each political order reflected an ecological ethic: balance, reciprocity, respect for cycles.
Spiritual landscapes. Religion for these peoples was less an institution than a relationship. The sacred was not confined to temples. It breathed in rivers and rocks, in wind and fire. Sun dances, green corn ceremonies, sweat lodges, and vision quests all served to maintain equilibrium between seen and unseen worlds. Shamans acted as mediators, bridging dream and daylight. Creation stories differed. Some spoke of emergence from underworlds, others of sky people descending. But all began with gratitude, a recognition that existence itself was a gift requiring care. Every hunt began with prayer. Every meal was a covenant with life. Children were taught to leave the first berries on the bush for birds, to thank the animal whose flesh sustained them. Spirituality was not about dominion, but participation. Moments of change. Climate shifts periodically altered patterns of life. Droughts pushed southwestern farmers to migrate. Floods changed river courses, reshaping trade. But societies adapted, reinventing themselves again and again. Resilience became cultural muscle memory. Some groups, like the Mississippians at Cahokia, eventually declined, perhaps due to environmental strain or political upheaval. Yet their descendants survived in reformed identities. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and others carried fragments of mound builder legacy into later centuries. Civilization did not vanish, it transformed. The continent before contact. By 1491, the year before Columbus's first voyage, scholars estimate that between 50 and 70 million people lived across the Americas. Fields of maize, beans, and squash rippled under the sun from Mexico to the Great Lakes. Irrigation ditches cut geometric patterns through desert valleys. Smoke rose from cooking fires in every direction. The continent was not a wilderness awaiting discovery. It was a mosaic of nations. Each region had its own calendar, architecture, diet, and philosophy. To walk from the Arctic tundra to the Yucatan was to pass through dozens of civilizations as distinct as Europe's kingdoms. There were cosmopolitan trade hubs, monastic farming villages, nomadic bands, and bustling port towns on both coasts. In short, this was already a world, complex, ancient, and self-sufficient. The first footsteps of strangers. Yet across the eastern sea, cartographers were drawing speculative continents. Rumors of a western land filled taverns and royal courts. When the first European sails eventually appeared on distant horizons, they were not heralds of discovery to the people who already lived here. They were omens. The long, self-contained narrative of the continent was about to be braided with another, filled with both catastrophe and creation. But for this moment, before contact changed everything, the land was still speaking its own language. Rivers still carried the songs of canoes. The wind still smelled of cedar, corn, and smoke. Children still learned constellations from their elders. Humanity and nature still walked in rhythm. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it, the deep heartbeat of America before it was called that name. A continent breathing, dreaming, and preparing unknowingly for the tides that would soon arrive. Continuing the series, to listen to Chapter 2, The Voyages That Changed the World, subscribe to the channel, click on the All button, and stay tuned at all times. Thank you.